From contract to love, shy billionaire falls hard for his arranged bride. Hello, let's start another beautiful story. Welcome to my channel. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Let's go. The corner office on the 47th floor of Callahan Technologies was silent, except for the gentle hum of the city below. Michael Callahan stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, his reflection a dark silhouette against the golden Manhattan sunset. In his hand, he held a crystal tumbler of untouched whiskey, a gift from his grandfather, Henry, who had just dropped a bomb that threatened to shatter Michael's carefully constructed world. 6 months, Michael muttered, placing the tumbler on his desk with more force than necessary. The amber liquid sloshed against the crystal, much like the turmoil in his stomach. His grandfather's words still rang in his ears. Get married within 6 months, or lose your position as CEO. At 34, Michael had transformed Callahan Technologies from a respected family business into a technological empire. Every decision he'd made had been calculated, precise, and profitable. Romance had never factored into his equations. He'd watched his parents' marriage crumble under the weight of their social obligations and ambitions. Their divorce had taught him early that love was a liability in their world. A soft knock interrupted his brooding. "Come in," he called, not turning from the window. Rebecca Chen, his executive assistant for the past 5 years, entered with her tablet in hand. She was one of the few people who could read his moods, and right now, her expression showed concern beneath her professional demeanor. I've rescheduled tomorrow's board meeting," she began, then paused, studying his rigid posture. "I take it the meeting with Mr. Henry didn't go well." Michael let out a harsh laugh. "That's an understatement." He finally turned to face her, his usually composed features showing signs of strain. "He's giving me an ultimatum, marriage within 6 months, or I lose my position." Rebecca's eyes widened slightly, but she quickly regained her composure. "I see." She tapped her tablet thoughtfully. "And I assume dating apps are out of the question." "Rebecca," his tone carried a warning. "Right," she nodded, already typing. "We'll need a more discreet solution." She hesitated for a moment before continuing. "Actually, I might have an idea. Have you ever considered a marriage of convenience?" Michael's dark eyebrows drew together. "You mean a contract?" "Exactly. A mutually beneficial arrangement with clear terms and an exit strategy." Rebecca's fingers flew across her tablet. "I know someone who might be perfect for this situation. She's trustworthy, intelligent, and most importantly, she needs financial assistance for her sister's medical treatment." "You want me to buy a wife?" Michael's voice dripped with skepticism. "I want you to enter into a business arrangement that benefits both parties," Rebecca corrected. Jessica Carter is different from the social climbers you usually avoid. She's worked as a freelance editor for several publishing houses, has a clean background, and she's been caring for her sister since their parents passed away." Michael returned to his desk, picking up the whiskey and taking a long sip. "Tell me more." Rebecca pulled up a photo on her tablet and turned it toward him. The woman in the picture had warm brown eyes and a gentle smile that seemed genuine rather than practiced. Her honey blonde hair fell in natural waves around her face, and she wore simple, professional attire. She looked real, approachable. The opposite of the polished socialites his grandfather usually threw in his path. "Her sister needs specialized treatment that insurance won't fully cover," Rebecca continued. "She's been working multiple jobs trying to make ends meet. A contract marriage would solve both your problems. You keep your position, and she gets the means to save her sister." Michael studied the photo longer than necessary. "Set up a meeting. Tomorrow. She's available for lunch at 12:30. He shot Rebecca a questioning look. "I may have already discussed the possibility with her," Rebecca admitted. "She's desperate enough to consider it, but principled enough to be trustworthy. The perfect combination for what you need." Michael nodded slowly, his mind already working through the logistics. "Draft a preliminary contract. 1-year term, generous compensation, strict confidentiality clauses, and Rebecca, He fixed her with a stern look. Make sure she understands this is strictly business. No romantic expectations. Of course. Rebecca headed for the door, then paused, although she turned back with an uncharacteristically hesitant expression. Sometimes the best business decisions lead to unexpected returns. Before Michael could respond, she was gone, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the lingering image of warm brown eyes that seemed to see right through his carefully constructed walls. He turned back to the window, watching as the city lights began to twinkle in the growing darkness. Tomorrow, he would meet Jessica Carter and propose a contract that would save both their futures. It was a simple business transaction, nothing more, nothing less. He ignored the small voice in the back of his mind that whispered this might be the biggest mistake of his life, or perhaps, though he'd never admit it, the best decision he'd ever make. Jessica Carter's hands trembled slightly as she smoothed down her navy blue dress, the nicest one she owned, purchased second-hand for job interviews. The maître d' of Le Bernardin led her through the restaurant with practiced grace, weaving between tables occupied by Manhattan's elite. She felt painfully out of place among the designer suits and gleaming jewelry, but she forced herself to keep her chin up. Her sister's voice echoed in her mind, "Jessie, you can't do this." It's crazy, but Annie hadn't seen the latest medical bills, hadn't heard the specialists discussing experimental treatments that could save her life, treatments their insurance wouldn't cover. Jessica would do anything for her sister, even if it meant meeting a billionaire to discuss selling herself into a year of marriage. She spotted him immediately. Michael Callahan sat alone at a corner table, his attention focused on a leather portfolio. Even seated, he radiated authority. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his charcoal suit clearly bespoke. He looked exactly like his photos from business magazines, but they hadn't captured the tension in his jaw or the way his fingers tapped restlessly against the table. "Mr. Callahan!" Her voice came out steadier than she felt. He looked up, and Jessica's breath caught. His eyes were a striking shade of grey, cold and analytical, yes, but with something else lurking beneath the surface. Vulnerability, perhaps. It vanished so quickly she might have imagined it. "Miss Carter." He stood, his movements precise and controlled. "Please, sit." A waiter materialized to pull out her chair, and Jessica sank into it, hyper-aware of Michael's scrutiny. Up close, she could see the faint shadows under his eyes, cleverly concealed but present nonetheless. He looked like a man who carried the weight of an empire on his shoulders. "I assume Rebecca explained the situation." His tone was clipped, professional. "She did." Jessica met his gaze directly. "Though I'd like to hear the terms from you." A flicker of surprise crossed his features, quickly masked. He opened the portfolio, removing a document. "And 1 year of marriage, you'll receive $5 million upon signing the contract, another 5 after the wedding, and a final 5 when we divorce. The money will be yours to keep, regardless of what happens." Jessica's heart pounded at the numbers, but she kept her expression neutral. "And the expectations. We'll live together at my estate in Greenwich. You'll attend necessary social functions as my wife. We'll maintain appearances in public, but in private, you'll have your own suite of rooms." He paused, studying her. "Complete discretion is essential. You'll need to sign extensive NDAs. And my sister's treatment will be fully covered at any facility you choose, including experimental options." His expression softened fractionally. "Rebecca mentioned she's at Mount Sinai." Jessica nodded, throat tight. "The doctors say there's a new treatment, but—" She trailed off, unwilling to show weakness in front of this man who treated emotions like inconvenient variables in an equation. To her surprise, Michael pushed a business card across the table. "Dr. Catherine Walsh, the best oncologist on the East Coast. I'll have her take your sister's case personally." "Thank you," Jessica whispered, tucking the card into her purse. The simple act of kindness threatened to crack her carefully maintained composure. "Don't thank me." His voice hardened. "This is a business transaction, Miss Carter, nothing more." "Of course." She straightened her shoulders. And what happens if feelings develop on either side? Michael's laugh was sharp and humorless. They won't. I don't believe in love, Miss Carter. It's a fantasy people use to dress up their basic instincts. We're both adults entering this arrangement with open eyes. Jessica studied him, seeing past the polished exterior to something wounded beneath. Everyone believes in love until they're hurt badly enough to stop. His eyes narrowed. We're not here to psychoanalyze each other. Are you interested in the arrangement or not? Yes, Jessica said simply. For my sister, yes. Michael nodded once. All business again. The contract will be ready tomorrow. We'll need to move quickly. The wedding must take place within 2 weeks to satisfy my grandfather's timeline. 2 weeks. Jessica's carefully maintained calm slipped. That's very fast. Is that a problem? She thought of Annie in her hospital bed, of the hope in her eyes when they discussed the new treatment. No, not a problem. Good. Michael signaled the waiter. Shall we discuss the details over lunch? As they ordered, Jessica caught him watching her with an unreadable expression. For a moment, something electric passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of two souls about to embark on something that would change them forever. Then Michael looked away, and the moment shattered like fine crystal hitting marble floors. One more thing, he said, his voice low and intense. Once we sign those papers, there's no backing out. Are you absolutely certain you can handle this? Jessica met his gaze steadily, letting him see her determination. Mr. Callahan, I've spent the last 5 years watching my sister fight for her life. I can handle anything. He nodded slowly, something like respect flickering in his grey eyes. Then let's begin. Outside, the Manhattan summer blazed, but inside Le Bernardin, Jessica felt a shiver run down her spine. She was about to marry a man who didn't believe in love to save her sister's life. It sounded like the plot of a romance novel, but there would be no happily ever after here. At least, that's what they both told themselves. The next 10 days passed in a whirlwind of preparations that left Jessica feeling like she'd stepped into someone else's life. Rebecca orchestrated everything with military precision. Dress fittings at Vera Wang, endless meetings with wedding planners, and carefully orchestrated public appearances to establish their courtship story. The media needs to believe this is a whirlwind romance, Rebecca explained, as she handed Jessica another stack of documents to sign. They sat in Michael's home office in Greenwich, surrounded by wedding plans and legal papers. Rich man meets brilliant editor, falls madly in love, can't wait to marry her. The press loves that narrative. Jessica's pen paused over yet another NDA. And what about Henry Callahan? Will he believe it? Henry's more perceptive than Michael gives him credit for. Rebecca's dark eyes held a knowing look. But he wants his grandson to be happy, even if Michael can't see that. The office door opened, and Michael strode in, already loosening his tie after another long day at Callahan Technologies. His eyes found Jessica immediately. Something unreadable flickering across his face before his usual mask slipped back into place. How's Annie doing with the new treatment? He asked, moving to his desk. Jessica's heart warmed at the question. For someone who claimed not to care about emotions, he asked about her sister daily. Better. Dr. Walsh is amazing. Annie's energy levels are already improving. Michael nodded, satisfaction briefly softening his features. Good. The insurance paperwork is finalized. Everything's covered, Rebecca confirmed. I've also arranged for a private nurse to assist when needed. Jessica swallowed hard against the surge of gratitude. Thank you, she said softly, looking at Michael, for everything you're doing for her. His jaw tightened. It's part of our agreement, nothing more. But Jessica had begun to notice how he avoided her eyes whenever she thanked him, as if her gratitude made him uncomfortable. She'd also caught him watching her when he thought she wasn't looking, his expression almost hungry. Not with desire exactly, but with a longing she recognized, the longing of someone who'd forgotten how to connect with others. The guest list is confirmed, Rebecca continued, tactfully changing the subject. 200 of New York's finest, all eager to see the mysterious woman who captured Michael Callahan's heart. Jessica's stomach churned. 200. It needs to be convincing, Michael said shortly. Speaking of which, we should practice. He crossed to where she sat and held out his hand. Jessica took it, trying to ignore the warmth that spread from his touch. He pulled her to her feet and into his arms with surprising gentleness. The first dance, he explained, his voice low. We can't look like strangers on our wedding day. Rebecca discreetly slipped out as Michael began leading Jessica in a slow waltz. His hand was firm against her lower back, his movements sure and practiced. Of course, he would be a perfect dancer. He'd probably had lessons since childhood. Relax, he murmured. You're too stiff. Sorry. Jessica forced her shoulders to loosen. I've never danced with a billionaire before. A hint of amusement touched his lips. And I've never danced with someone who makes sarcastic comments about my wealth. It's refreshing. They moved together in silence for a moment, finding their rhythm. Jessica was acutely aware of his cologne, something expensive and subtle that made her want to lean closer. You're nervous about the wedding, he observed. Aren't you? She looked up at him, searching his face. 200 people watching us pretend to be in love. His steps faltered slightly. We're not pretending to be in love. We're pretending to be making a sensible match. Love is a fantasy, Jessica finished. Yes, you've mentioned that several times. Something flashed in his eyes. Anger, frustration. You disagree. I think, she said carefully, that someone who truly didn't believe in love wouldn't need to keep saying it out loud. Michael's hand tightened on her waist. You think you know me because we're getting married? No. Jessica held his gaze. I think I know you because you check on my sister every day, arrange the best doctor in New York for her, and make sure she has everything she needs, all while insisting you don't care about anyone. He stopped dancing abruptly, stepping back as if she'd burned him. Don't make the mistake of reading too much into business decisions, Miss Carter. We're getting married in 4 days, she reminded him softly. And maybe you should start calling me Jessica. His expression hardened. This isn't real. The sooner you accept that, the easier this year will be. But as he strode from the office, Jessica noticed his hands were shaking slightly. She sank back into her chair, surrounded by wedding plans for a marriage that was supposedly just business. The problem was, her heart hadn't gotten that memo. Every time Michael showed a flash of kindness beneath his cold exterior, every time she caught him watching her with that lost expression, every time he said her sister's name with genuine concern, she felt herself falling a little deeper into dangerous territory. This was supposed to be a simple contract, her freedom for her sister's life. But as she stared at the wedding invitation on the desk, heavy cream cardstock announcing the union of Michael James Callahan and Jessica Marie Carter, she had a sinking feeling that nothing about this arrangement would be simple at all. The bridal suite at St. Patrick's Cathedral buzzed with activity, but Jessica stood motionless before the full-length mirror, barely recognizing herself. The Vera Wang gown was a masterpiece of silk and lace, its simplicity elegant rather than ostentatious. Her honey-blonde hair fell in soft waves beneath a cathedral-length veil, and around her neck lay a single strand of pearls, borrowed from the Callahan family vault. You look beautiful, Jessie. Annie's voice was stronger than it had been in months, thanks to Dr. Walsh's treatments. She sat in a plush chair nearby, her pale features glowing with joy despite her fatigue. Jessica met her sister's eyes in the mirror. Are you sure you're feeling up to this? Wild horses couldn't keep me away. Annie's smile turned mischievous. Besides, I want to see the look on your billionaire's face when he sees you in that dress. He's not my billionaire, Jessica corrected automatically, but her heart fluttered at the thought of Michael's reaction. She'd caught glimpses of him over the past few days, always surrounded by wedding planners or family obligations. Each time their eyes met, that same electric current had passed between them, growing stronger with each encounter. Rebecca entered, elegant in her maid-of-honor dress. It's time. She paused, studying Jessica with knowing eyes. Are you ready? Jessica thought of the contract locked in Michael's safe, of the millions that would save her sister's life, of the man waiting at the altar who claimed not to believe in love. Yes, the cathedral fell silent as the wedding march began. Jessica's hand trembled on her bouquet of white roses as she took her first step down the aisle. 200 of New York's elite turned to watch her, but she saw only Michael. He stood tall and commanding in his tuxedo, his grey eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. For a moment, his carefully maintained mask slipped, revealing something raw and vulnerable in his expression. Then his features smoothed back into polite pleasure, the perfect groom greeting his bride. But Jessica had seen it, that flash of genuine emotion that gave her hope that perhaps beneath all his walls and defenses, Michael Callahan's heart wasn't quite as frozen as he claimed. The ceremony passed in a blur of traditional vows and meaningful glances. When Michael slipped the platinum band onto her finger, a fortune in diamonds that felt impossibly heavy, his hands were warm and steady against hers. "I do," he said clearly, his voice carrying to the rafters. Only Jessica noticed the slight catch in his throat. At the reception in the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel, they played their parts perfectly. Michael kept her close, his hand resting possessively on her lower back as they greeted guests. He'd prepared her well for this moment, briefing her on every important person they would meet. "Grandson!" Henry Callahan's booming voice cut through the crowd. The family patriarch approached, his eyes twinkling with satisfaction. "You've outdone yourself, Jessica, my dear. You're a vision." Jessica felt Michael tense beside her. "Thank you, Mr. Callahan. Please, call me Henry." He kissed her cheek, then fixed Michael with a knowing look. "Sometimes the best business decisions come from the heart. Wouldn't you agree?" Michael's jaw tightened. "And if you'll excuse us, Grandfather, I believe they're about to announce our first dance." As they moved onto the dance floor, Michael pulled Jessica closer than necessary. "Ignore him," he muttered. "He thinks he's won some sort of victory." "Hasn't he?" Jessica asked softly. "You did what he wanted, for business reasons only." But Michael's hand spread wider against her back, his thumb absently stroking the silk of her gown. They swayed to the music, all eyes on them. Jessica could feel the warmth of his body through the layers of fabric, could smell that intoxicating cologne that had haunted her dreams. "Michael?" His eyes were distant, lost in thought. "Thank you for making sure Annie could be here today. Seeing her smile again, it means everything." His steps faltered slightly. "Jessica." He looked down at her, conflict clear in his expression. For a moment, she thought he might say something real, something true. Instead, he schooled his features back into pleasant neutrality as photographers circled them. "You look beautiful," he said, loud enough for others to hear. Hours later, they finally escaped to the penthouse suite. Jessica's feet ached from dancing. Her cheeks hurt from smiling, and her head spun slightly from champagne. She stood in the massive living room, watching the city lights twinkle beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Your room is through there," Michael said quietly, gesturing to a door on the left. "Mine's on the right. We'll head to Greenwich tomorrow." Jessica turned to face him, suddenly aware that this was real. They were married. She was Mrs. Callahan, at least for the next year. "Michael!" He crossed to the bar, pouring himself a whiskey. Don't." His voice was rough. "Don't make this more than it is." "And what is it?" She moved closer, emboldened by champagne and the emotions of the day. "Because I saw your face when I walked down that aisle. You felt something." Michael's knuckles whitened around his glass. "What I felt was satisfaction at a plan well executed. Nothing more." "Liar!" The word slipped out before she could stop it. He set the glass down with careful precision. "Careful, Jessica. Don't mistake acting for reality." "Fine." She lifted her chin. "Then look me in the eyes and tell me you feel nothing. Tell me your hands don't shake when I'm near. Tell me you don't watch me when you think I'm not looking." Michael moved with sudden speed, closing the distance between them until she could see the flecks of silver in his eyes. "What do you want from me?" he demanded, his voice low and intense. A declaration of love, romance. I told you from the beginning, I don't believe in any of that. No, Jessica whispered. You're too afraid to believe in it. There's a difference. For a moment, she thought he might kiss her. His gaze dropped to her lips, and the air between them crackled with possibility. Then he stepped back, his expression closing off. Good night, Mrs. Callahan. He disappeared into his room, leaving Jessica alone with the ghosts of everything they weren't saying. She touched her wedding ring, feeling its weight, a symbol of promises made for show and feelings denied in truth. In separate rooms, both bride and groom lay awake, telling themselves this was just business, just a contract, just a means to an end. Neither quite believed it anymore. The Callahan estate in Greenwich sprawled across 12 manicured acres, a testament to old money and careful preservation. To Jessica, it felt more like a museum than a home, all polished surfaces and perfect symmetry with nothing out of place. After 2 weeks of marriage, she still found herself tiptoeing through the grand halls, afraid to disturb the careful order of Michael's world. That order shattered one rainy morning when she entered the kitchen to find Michael attempting to make coffee, his usual composure notably absent. His dark hair was disheveled, his white dress shirt wrinkled, and he was glaring at the elaborate espresso machine as if it had personally offended him. The housekeeper has the week off, he muttered, without turning around. And this infernal machine. Jessica bit back a smile. When's your first meeting? 20 minutes. He jabbed at buttons randomly. Let me. She moved beside him, close enough to catch the fresh scent of his shower gel. And it's not that complicated once you know the tricks. Michael stepped back, watching as she expertly operated the machine. His presence behind her was distracting, radiating warmth and something else. A tension that seemed to grow stronger each day they spent under the same roof. Where did you learn to use one of these? He asked. I worked at a coffee shop through college. She handed him a perfect cappuccino. Before I started editing, something flickered in his eyes. Interest, maybe respect. You never mentioned that. You never asked. She met his gaze steadily. There's a lot we don't know about each other, considering we're married. Michael took a sip of coffee, then blinked in surprise. This is excellent. Don't sound so shocked. She started making her own drink. Poor people can have skills, too. His expression tightened. I didn't mean... I know what you meant. She softened her tone. It's fine. We come from different worlds. And yet here we are. He studied her over the rim of his cup. How are you settling in? The question surprised her. It was the first time he'd asked about her comfort rather than just her sister's health. It's different. Quiet. Too quiet. No, I like it. She thought of her cramped apartment in Queens, with its constant street noise and temperamental heating. Although I miss cooking, you cook. Another surprised look. Is that so hard to believe? No, He hesitated. The kitchen is yours to use if you want. No need to wait for Mrs. Peterson to return. Jessica's heart warmed at the offer. Really? It's your home too, for the next year at least. He checked his watch and straightened. I should go. Thank you for the coffee. He was nearly to the door when she called after him. Michael, what's your favorite food? He turned back, confusion crossing his features. Why? Because that's the kind of thing married people know about each other. She shrugged. Even fake married people? For a moment, she thought he might shut down, retreat behind his walls. Instead, a ghost of a smile touched his lips. Beef bourguignon. My grandmother used to make it. The simple admission felt like a gift, a tiny piece of his closely guarded past, offered freely. I'll keep that in mind. That evening, Jessica lost herself in the kitchen, chopping vegetables and searing meat with practiced ease. The familiar motions calmed her, helped her forget the strangeness of her situation. She was so absorbed in her task that she didn't hear Michael return until he spoke from the doorway. Something smells amazing. She turned to find him watching her, his tie loosened and jacket gone. I thought we could have dinner together, since we're married and all. His expression was unreadable. You didn't have to. I wanted to. She gestured to the pot simmering on the stove. And it's not exactly beef bourguignon, but I make a decent coq au vin. Michael moved closer, peering into the pot. You made this from scratch. Don't sound so impressed. It's just chicken and wine. But she felt a flutter of pleasure at his obvious appreciation. I usually eat in my office. I know. She handed him plates to set the table. But maybe it's time for a change. To her surprise, he didn't argue. They worked in comfortable silence, setting the table in the informal dining room rather than the grand formal space. When Jessica opened a bottle of wine, Michael raised an eyebrow. From your cellar, she explained. I hope that's okay. Of course. He poured for both of them. It's yours too, remember. They sat down to eat, and Jessica watched nervously as Michael took his first bite. His eyes widened slightly. This is exceptional. Now you're just being polite. I'm never just polite. He took another bite. Where did you learn to cook like this? My mom taught me. Jessica smiled at the memory. She said good food brings people together, makes them forget their differences for a while. Michael was quiet for a moment. My mother never cooked. She said that's what staff was for. And your grandmother? The one who made beef bourguignon. She died when I was 12. His voice held a hint of old pain. She was different from the rest of the family, warmer. Jessica touched his hand without thinking. You miss her. He stared at their joined hands, but didn't pull away. It was a long time ago. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken understanding. Then Michael's phone buzzed, shattering the spell. He withdrew his hand to check it. Annie's latest test results, he said, scanning the screen. Dr. Walsh says the treatment is progressing well. Jessica's heart swelled with gratitude and something else, something dangerous and warm that she couldn't afford to name. Thank you for checking on her. It's just business, he said automatically, but his voice lacked conviction. They finished dinner in companionable silence, and when Michael insisted on helping with the dishes, Jessica didn't argue. Their hands brushed occasionally as they passed plates back and forth, each touch sending sparks along her skin. Later, alone in her suite, Jessica touched her wedding ring and thought about the man whose name she now carried. A man who claimed not to believe in love but checked her sister's medical reports daily, who said he always ate in his office but had sat with her for over an hour, sharing stories and wine, who maintained careful distance even as his walls began to crack. In his own room, Michael stared at a photo on his phone. Jessica in his kitchen, flour on her cheek as she cooked, smiling at something he'd said. He'd taken it without thinking, caught by the simple beauty of the moment. Now he couldn't bring himself to delete it. Both of them lay awake, wondering how long they could maintain this careful dance of proximity without touch, of intimacy without acknowledgement, of feelings without names. The answer, though neither would admit it, was not very long at all. The annual Callahan Technologies Charity Gala was the social event of the season, and Jessica's first real test as Mrs. Michael Callahan. She stood in front of her closet, staring at the designer gown Rebecca had selected, a midnight blue creation that probably cost more than her old apartment's yearly rent. A knock at her door interrupted her nervous contemplation. Come in. Rebecca entered, already perfectly styled for the evening. Time for hair and makeup. The team is waiting in the dressing room. She paused, noting Jessica's expression. Nervous? Terrified? Jessica managed a weak smile. Oh, the wedding was one thing. Everyone was focused on the ceremony. This is different. Hours of small talk with people who'll be watching my every move, judging whether I'm good enough for the Callahan name. You'll be fine. Rebecca's voice held absolute certainty. Just remember, you're not the outsider they think you are. You're Michael's wife, and he chose you for a contract. Jessica reminded her quietly. Rebecca's expression turned shrewd. Oh, but is that still all it is? Before Jessica could respond, another knock came at the door. This time it was Michael, impeccable in his tuxedo. He stopped short at the sight of Jessica in her robe, hair still loose around her shoulders. "I'll tell the team you're ready," Rebecca said smoothly, slipping out. Michael cleared his throat. "I wanted to brief you on some key people who'll be attending tonight. More names to memorize." Jessica tried to joke, but her voice trembled slightly. He moved closer, studying her face. "You're worried? I don't want to embarrass you." Something softened in his expression. "You couldn't." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a velvet box. "I brought you something for tonight." Jessica opened the box and gasped. A diamond necklace lay nestled inside, its stones catching the light like captured stars. "Michael, this is too much. It's from the family collection." He lifted the necklace out. "Turn around." She obeyed, holding her breath as he swept her hair aside. His fingers brushed her neck as he fastened the clasp, lingering longer than necessary. The diamonds felt cool against her skin, but his touch burned. "There." His voice was rougher than usual. Now you look like a Callahan." She turned to face him. "Is that what you want, for me to become one of them?" His eyes darkened. "No, I want—" He stopped, jaw tightening. "The car leaves in an hour. Don't be late." He strode out, leaving Jessica to wonder what he'd been about to say. 3 hours later, she stood beside him in the grand ballroom of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, playing the role of devoted wife. Michael kept her close, his hand at the small of her back as they moved through the crowd. To anyone watching, they looked like the perfect couple, the powerful CEO and his beautiful new bride. "Darling," a woman in her 50s approached, dripping in diamonds and insecurity. "You must be Jessica. I'm Victoria Pierce, an old friend of the family." Jessica felt Michael tense beside her. "Mrs. Pierce, lovely to see you. We were all so surprised by this whirlwind romance." Victoria's smile didn't reach her eyes, especially after Michael and my Charlotte were so close last summer. "Ah, so that was it." Jessica leaned into Michael's side, feeling him automatically adjust to support her. "Sometimes when you just know." "Right, darling." Michael's hand tightened on her waist. "And exactly." He bent and pressed a kiss to her temple, the gesture so natural it made her heart ache. "If you'll excuse us, I believe they're about to begin the auction." As they moved away, Jessica whispered, "Charlotte Pierce." "A mistake I'd rather forget." His voice was clipped. "Her mother's been trying to orchestrate a match for years." "Poor Charlotte." He looked down at her in surprise. "You feel sorry for her?" "Of course." "Imagine wanting someone who doesn't want you back." The words hit too close to home, and Jessica quickly added, "Not that she really wanted you. Probably just your name and money." "Like you?" The moment he said it, regret flashed across his face. "Jessica, I didn't—" "No, you're right." She pulled away from him. "That's exactly what this is. Excuse me, I need some air." She fled to a balcony overlooking the museum's courtyard, the cool night air helping to calm her racing heart. She'd known what this was from the beginning, a business arrangement, nothing more. So why did his words hurt so much? "I'm sorry." Michael's voice came from behind her. "That was cruel and unfair, but true." She didn't turn around. "I did marry you for money, to save your sister." He moved to stand beside her. "There's a difference." "Is there?" She finally looked at him. "Would you have chosen me if you didn't need to satisfy your grandfather's ultimatum?" His expression twisted. "That's not—" "Mr. Callahan," a voice called from inside. "The bidding is about to start." Michael hesitated. "We should go back in." "Of course." Jessica straightened her spine and fixed a smile on her face. "We have roles to play, after all." But as they returned to the party, something had shifted between them. Every touch, every shared glance, every practiced gesture of affection felt charged with new meaning. When Michael pulled her onto the dance floor, his hold was different, less calculated, more desperate. "I wouldn't have chosen you," he said suddenly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Jessica's heart clenched. "I know. Because I wouldn't have let myself know you at all." His eyes held hers, filled with confusion and something that looked dangerously like desire. "And now." The music ended before he could respond. They broke apart as applause filled the room. the moment lost in the crush of society and expectations. Later that night, as their car wound through the quiet streets toward Greenwich, Jessica dozed against Michael's shoulder. She was too tired to maintain careful distance, and he was too lost in thought to push her away. "You were amazing tonight," he said softly, probably thinking she was asleep. "Too amazing. You make me want—" He didn't finish the sentence, but his arm tightened around her, pulling her closer as she pretended to sleep. In the dark car, with the city lights blurring past, both of them let themselves imagine, just for a moment, that this wasn't pretend at all. The call came at 3:47 a.m., shattering the quiet of the Greenwich estate. Jessica fumbled for her phone in the dark, her heart stopping when she saw the hospital's number. "Annie?" Her voice cracked with fear. "Mrs. Callahan, your sister's had a severe reaction to the treatment. She's stable now, but—" Jessica was already moving, throwing on clothes with shaking hands. She had to get to Manhattan, had to see Annie, had to— Her bedroom door burst open, revealing Michael in pajama pants and a t-shirt, his hair disheveled from sleep. "What's wrong?" She stared at him, phone still pressed to her ear as the nurse continued speaking. Michael crossed the room in 3 long strides, taking the phone from her trembling fingers. "This is Michael Callahan. Yes, we'll be there in 30 minutes. Have Dr. Walsh called immediately." He ended the call and turned to Jessica. "Car's already waiting. Do you need help packing a bag?" She shook her head, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. "Come on." His hand found the small of her back, steady and warm. "I've got you." The drive to Manhattan passed in a blur. Jessica stared out the window at the pre-dawn darkness, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. Without warning, Michael reached over and covered her hands with one of his. "She's strong," he said quietly, "like her sister." Jessica turned her hand over, lacing her fingers through his. He didn't pull away. At Mount Sinai, Dr. Walsh was waiting for them. "The new treatment triggered an unexpected immune response," she explained. "We've stabilized her, but we need to modify the protocol, whatever it costs." Michael said immediately. Dr. Walsh nodded. "We'll start the new regimen immediately. She's asking for you, Jessica." Annie looked small in the hospital bed, but her smile was still bright. "Hey, sis! Sorry for the drama." Jessica rushed to her side, careful of the IV lines. "Don't you dare apologize. Your husband's been pacing outside like a guard dog." Annie's voice was weak but teasing. "He really does take care of you, doesn't he?" Jessica glanced through the window, where Michael stood talking intensely with Dr. Walsh. "It's not like that. He's just concerned about his investment." Annie raised an eyebrow. "Is that why he hasn't left the hospital once in 4 hours? Why he's been holding your hand every time I wake up?" Jessica hadn't even realized he'd stayed. She'd been so focused on Annie, but now that she thought about it, Michael had been a constant presence, getting her coffee, handling paperwork, making sure she ate something. "It's complicated," she whispered. "Love usually is." Annie squeezed her hand. "But the way he looks at you when you're not watching, that's not complicated at all." Before Jessica could respond, Michael entered with 2 coffee cups. "Annie, feeling better?" "Much." Annie's smile turned mischievous. "Thanks to my wonderful brother-in-law." Michael's expression softened. Something Jessica had noticed happened often around Annie. "Get some rest. I need to borrow your sister for a moment." In the hallway, Michael handed Jessica a coffee. "Dr. Walsh wants to try an experimental treatment combination. I've already approved it." "Michael, the cost is not your concern." His voice was firm. "This is what the contract was for, remember." The word contract hit her like a physical blow. After hours of his quiet support and gentle touches, she'd almost forgotten this wasn't real. "Right," she said stiffly. "The contract," he frowned. "Jessica, I should get back to Annie. You need rest too." He caught her arm as she turned away. "You've been here for 18 hours straight. I'm fine. You're exhausted." His thumb traced circles on her skin. Let me take you home. We can come back first thing tomorrow. This is my sister, Michael. I can't just... Trust me." His eyes held hers. "Please." Something in his voice made her pause. "Why do you care so much?" "Because you're my..." He stopped, jaw tightening. "Your what?" "Your business arrangement. Your convenient solution to your grandfather's ultimatum." "You know it's more than that." The words seemed torn from him. "Do I?" Jessica stepped closer, challenging him. "Then tell me what this is, Michael. Tell me why you stayed here all day. Why you hold my hand when you think I'm sleeping. Why you look at me like..." He kissed her. It wasn't gentle or hesitant. His mouth claimed hers with desperate intensity, one hand tangling in her hair while the other pulled her against him. Jessica melted into him, all the fear and exhaustion of the day channeling into this one burning moment of connection. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Michael rested his forehead against hers. "I can't," he whispered. "I can't feel this. It wasn't supposed to be like this." "Michael!" He stepped back abruptly, his walls slamming back into place. "I'll have Rebecca bring you a change of clothes. The driver can take you home whenever you're ready." "Don't!" Jessica's voice cracked. "Don't run away from this." This was a mistake. He wouldn't meet her eyes. "We need to remember what this arrangement is, what it isn't. And what if I don't want to remember?" She moved toward him, but he backed away. "Then I'll remember for both of us." His voice was cold again, all traces of tenderness gone. "Get some rest, Jessica. I'll check on Annie's treatment in the morning." He strode away, leaving her alone in the sterile hospital hallway. Jessica touched her lips, still burning from his kiss, and fought back tears. Inside Annie's room, her sister was pretending to sleep, but Jessica saw the concern in her eyes. "Oh, Jessie," she whispered, "what have you gotten yourself into? I don't know anymore." Jessica sank into the chair beside the bed. "I really don't know." But she did know. She'd broken the cardinal rule of their arrangement. She'd fallen in love with her husband. And now, watching him walk away from the one real moment they'd shared, she realized just how thoroughly she'd destroyed everything. In his car, Michael gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles went white, trying to forget the taste of her lips, the soft sound she'd made when he kissed her, the way she'd looked at him with such hope and longing. "It's not real," he told himself. "It can't be real." But as dawn broke over Manhattan, neither of them believed that lie anymore. For 3 days after the kiss, Michael buried himself in work, leaving the house before dawn and returning long after Jessica had gone to bed. Their only communication came through Rebecca, who relayed updates about Annie's improving condition and the success of her modified treatment. Jessica spent her days at the hospital, trying not to think about the way Michael's lips had felt against hers, or how his arms had held her like she was something precious. She told herself it was better this way, safer. They could pretend nothing had happened, go back to their careful choreography of distance and denial. Then a storm hit Greenwich, bringing with it the kind of driving rain that made the old estate creak and groan. Jessica sat in the library, trying to focus on a book while thunder rolled overhead. She'd just decided to head up to bed when she heard the front door open. Michael stood in the foyer, soaked through and looking exhausted. His usual pristine appearance was completely undone. Suit jacket dripping, dark hair plastered to his forehead, tie hanging loose around his neck. "You're home early," she said softly. He startled at her voice, turning to face her. For a moment, raw emotion flickered across his features before he could hide it. "The roads are flooding. Rebecca insisted I leave before it got worse." "You're freezing." Jessica moved closer, concern overriding her caution. "Let me get you a towel." "I'm fine." But his teeth were chattering. "Don't be stubborn." She caught his arm, ignoring how her pulse jumped at the contact. "Come on." To her surprise, he followed her to the kitchen without argument. She sat him at the breakfast bar and busied herself making hot tea, trying not to notice how his wet shirt clung to his shoulders. "You shouldn't wait up," he said roughly. "I wasn't." She set a steaming mug in front of him. "I couldn't sleep. The storm. Still afraid of thunder." Jessica blinked, surprised he remembered that detail from one of their early conversations. Sometimes, Michael's hands wrapped around the mug, his wedding ring glinting in the soft kitchen light. Annie's latest results came in today. I know, Rebecca told me. She leaned against the counter, maintaining careful distance. The new treatment is working. Good. He stared into his tea. That's good. Silence stretched between them, filled with all the things they weren't saying. Outside, the storm raged on. Michael, don't. His voice was strained. Please, we have to talk about what happened. No, we don't. He stood abruptly. It was a mistake. We were both emotional, tired. Stop! Jessica moved around the counter, forcing him to look at her. Stop making excuses. Stop pretending you don't feel anything. What I feel doesn't matter. His eyes were tortured. This isn't real, Jessica. It can't be real. Why not? She stepped closer, watching his breath hitch. Because you're afraid. Because it's not part of our agreement. The words exploded out of him. Because in 6 months, this ends. You take the money, save your sister, and move on with your life. That was the deal. And if I don't want that anymore? Michael's hands clenched at his sides. Don't. Why? She was close enough now to see the pulse jumping in his throat. Because it's easier to hide behind contracts and business arrangements than admit you might actually care about someone. You don't understand. He ran a hand through his wet hair in frustration. I can't let myself. Thunder cracked overhead, making Jessica jump. Without thinking, Michael reached for her, pulling her against his chest. For a moment, they stood frozen, hearts racing, bodies pressed together. I should go, he whispered, but his arms tightened around her. Stay. She looked up at him, seeing the conflict raging in his eyes. Please. Slowly, giving her time to pull away, Michael lowered his head. This kiss was different from their first, gentle, almost reverent. His lips moved softly against hers, one hand coming up to cradle her face while the other splayed across her lower back. Jessica wound her arms around his neck, pressing closer. She could taste tea and rain on his lips, feel the tremors running through his body. When she sighed into his mouth, he groaned and deepened the kiss, backing her against the counter. The sharp ring of his phone shattered the moment. Michael jerked away like he'd been burned, fumbling for his phone. Callahan, he answered, voice rough, his expression hardened as he listened. I'll be right there. What's wrong? Emergency board meeting. He wouldn't meet her eyes. Don't wait up. Michael, wait. But he was already gone, leaving Jessica alone in the kitchen with swollen lips and a breaking heart. Hours later, she lay in bed listening to him return, his footsteps pausing outside her door for a long moment before continuing to his room. In the morning, she found a note on the breakfast bar. I'm sorry. This can't happen again. Jessica traced his precise handwriting, remembering the way he'd held her, the tenderness in his kiss belying the coldness of his words. She'd known from the beginning that falling in love with Michael Callahan would be a mistake. She just hadn't expected it to hurt quite this much. In his office across town, Michael stared unseeing at his computer screen, still able to feel Jessica in his arms, taste her on his lips. The memory of her soft, please, haunted him, along with the look in her eyes when he'd pulled away. His phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. Annie's latest scan shows the tumor shrinking. Treatment working better than expected. He should feel only professional satisfaction at the news. Instead, his heart ached with the knowledge that the better Annie got, the closer they came to the end of their agreement. Soon, Jessica would have what she needed, money for her sister's complete recovery. She'd leave, taking with her the warmth and light she'd brought to his carefully ordered world. It was what he'd wanted from the beginning, a clean, professional arrangement with a clear end date. So why did the thought of her leaving feel like dying? The email arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning, its subject line making Jessica's blood run cold. Your secret's worth millions. Her hands shook as she opened it, already knowing who it was from. Jessie, funny thing about timing, I was having drinks with Charlotte Pierce last night, and she had some very interesting theories about your sudden marriage to Michael Callahan. Got me thinking about how desperate you were for money right before the wedding. About all those hospital bills for Annie. Would the board of Callahan Technologies be interested in knowing their CEO bought himself a wife? We should talk. Soon. Noah. Jessica deleted the email, but the words burned in her memory. Noah had always been manipulative, but this was different. This was a threat that could destroy everything. Not just her arrangement with Michael, but his entire career. She should tell him immediately. Instead, she found herself reaching for her phone and calling Noah. "I knew you'd call." His voice was smooth, satisfied. "Let's meet. The old coffee shop in Queens. 2 hours. Noah, come alone, Jessie, or the next email goes straight to the Callahan Technologies board." The line went dead. Jessica stared at her phone, mind racing. She should tell Michael. Should let him handle this with his lawyers and PR team. But the thought of seeing that final bit of warmth disappear from his eyes when he realized she'd brought this danger into his life. 2 hours later, she sat in a corner booth of Been There, Done That, watching Noah swagger through the door. He looked exactly the same, handsome in that polished, artificial way, with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. "You look good, Jessie." He slid into the booth. "Marriage suits you. What do you want, Noah?" "Straight to business." He clicked his tongue. "Fine. $10 million. And your secret stays safe." Jessica's laugh was hollow. "You really think I have access to that kind of money?" "No, but your husband does." Noah leaned forward. "And I bet he'd pay a lot more than that to keep this quiet. Unless," his smile turned cruel, "unless he's already planning to divorce you. Is that why you're here alone?" Before Jessica could respond, a shadow fell across the table. "She's not alone." Michael stood there, radiating cold fury. Noah's smug expression faltered. "Mr. Callahan, Mr. Pierce." Michael's voice could have frozen hell. "I believe you have something to discuss with me." Jessica's heart stopped. "Michael." He didn't look at her as he slid into the booth, effectively trapping Noah against the wall. "Did you really think I wouldn't have security monitoring my wife's email? That I wouldn't follow her when she went to meet someone who threatened her?" Noah's confidence crumbled. "Look, this is just a misunderstanding." "No, this is blackmail." Michael's smile was terrifying. "And I don't respond well to threats against my family." The word family hit Jessica like a physical blow. Michael continued, each word precise and deadly. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to forget whatever theories Charlotte Pierce shared during your pathetic attempt at corporate espionage. You're going to never contact my wife again, and in return, I won't destroy every aspect of your professional and personal life." He slid a folder across the table. "Though I could, easily." Noah opened the folder, his face going pale. "How did you—" "I protect what's mine." Michael's voice was ice. "Remember that?" Noah practically ran from the coffee shop. Only then did Michael turn to Jessica, his expression unreadable. The cars outside. The ride back to Greenwich was silent, tension crackling between them. When they arrived, Michael headed straight for his study. Jessica followed, her guilt and fear finally spilling over. "I'm sorry," she burst out. "I should have told you immediately. I didn't want you to think I'd brought this trouble into your life, that I wasn't worth—" "Worth what?" Michael spun to face her, his control finally cracking. "Worth protecting, worth fighting for. Damn it, Jessica, do you have any idea what could have happened? I was trying to protect you. That's my job." The words exploded from him. "You're my wife." "No," Jessica said quietly. "I'm your contract." All the anger seemed to drain from him, leaving something raw and vulnerable in its place. "Is that really what you think? Isn't it what you keep telling me?" Michael moved closer, his eyes intense. "Do you think I have security monitoring all my business contracts? That I track their movements, investigate anyone who might hurt them, lay awake at night wondering if they're safe?" Jessica's breath caught. "Michael, do you think I kiss my business contracts in the middle of storms?" His voice dropped to a whisper. that I spend every moment fighting the urge to kiss them again. Then stop fighting. She reached for him, hands fisting in his shirt. Please, just stop fighting this. For a moment, she thought he would. His hands came up to frame her face, thumbs brushing her cheeks. Then something shuttered in his eyes. I can't. He stepped back. This thing with Noah proves why we need boundaries, why we can't let emotions complicate things. It's too late for that. Jessica's voice cracked. At least for me. Michael's expression was agonized. Jessica, no, you don't have to say it. She managed a brittle smile. I know this isn't real for you, that I'm just another asset to protect. I understand. She turned to leave, but his next words stopped her cold. You're wrong. His voice was so quiet she almost missed it. It's real, too real. That's why it's so dangerous. By the time she turned back, he was gone, leaving her alone with the weight of everything they'd admitted, and everything they still couldn't say. In his office across town, Michael stared at the dossier on Noah Pierce, at the security report showing Jessica's every movement, at the countless ways he'd tried to protect her without admitting why. And she could have been hurt, he told Rebecca, who had appeared silently in his doorway. But she wasn't. Rebecca's voice was gentle. Thanks to you. I can't lose her. The admission seemed torn from him, and that's exactly why I have to let her go. Rebecca studied him for a long moment. You know, for a brilliant businessman, you can be remarkably stupid about what matters most. She left him alone with that thought, and with the growing realization that some contracts, once signed, changed not just on paper, but in the heart. Henry Callahan rarely visited the Greenwich estate unannounced, so when Jessica opened the door to find him on the steps one rainy Saturday morning, she knew something had shifted in their carefully balanced world. My dear, he kissed her cheek, his eyes sharp despite his grandfatherly manner. I hope I'm not interrupting. Michael's at the office. Even on weekends now, he found reasons to be away. Actually, I came to see you. Henry followed her to the living room, settling into an armchair with the air of a man about to conduct important business. I had an interesting conversation with Charlotte Pierce's mother yesterday. Jessica's heart stuttered. Oh, Henry studied her carefully. She seemed quite concerned about certain rumors regarding your marriage to my grandson. Naturally, I assured her that such gossip was beneath notice. Mr. Callahan, Henry, please. He leaned forward. Jessica, do you know why I gave Michael that ultimatum about marriage? She shook her head, thrown by the sudden change in topic. Because I watched him turning into stone. Henry's voice softened. And every year, every success, every perfectly executed business deal, they were all just walls he was building around himself. I was losing him, just like I lost his father to ambition and his mother to bitterness. He's not lost, Jessica said quietly. He cares so much about everything. He just doesn't know how to show it. No, Henry's eyes twinkled. Then why did he spend 3 days investigating everyone who's ever wronged you after that business with Noah Pierce? Why does he have Dr. Walsh send him hourly updates on your sister's condition? Why does he sit in his office every night staring at security footage of you in the garden or the kitchen or the library? Jessica's breath caught. How do you... I may be old, my dear, but I still have eyes. And what I see is my grandson falling in love for the first time in his life and running from it as fast as he can. It's not like that, but her voice wavered. This marriage, it's just business. Is it? Henry pulled an envelope from his jacket. Then perhaps you can explain this. Inside was a letter dated 2 days after Noah's threat. Dear Mr. Henry Callahan, I'm writing to inform you of my intention to transfer all personal assets, including my trust fund and private investments, to a medical care fund for Annie Carter. This transfer will ensure her treatment continues, regardless of any changes in circumstances. The amount should cover all current and future medical needs, making the original marriage contract unnecessary. Please have legal prepare divorce papers immediately. Michael Callahan. Jessica's hands trembled. I don't understand. Don't you? Henry's voice was gentle. He's trying to free you, to give you everything you needed without keeping you bound to him. He thinks he's protecting you from himself, from his inability to love the way you deserve. But I don't want to be free. The words escaped before she could stop them. I know. Henry stood, patting her hand. And I think it's time he knew too. Don't you? He left her there, clutching Michael's letter and fighting tears. She was still sitting in the same spot when the front door opened hours later. Michael stopped short at the sight of her. Jessica, what's wrong? She held up the letter. Were you going to tell me? He went very still. Where did you get that? Your grandfather brought it. She stood, anger and hurt and love warring in her chest. Were you really going to just set me free? Without even asking what I wanted. It's for the best. But he wouldn't meet her eyes. This way, you get everything you needed without having to what? Put up with you? Pretend to be your wife? Fall in love with you? The last words hung in the air between them. Michael's face went pale. You don't love me, he said roughly. You can't. Why not? Because I don't know how to love. The words exploded from him. Udus, I'll hurt you, disappoint you, fail you like I failed everyone else. You deserve better than a man who had to buy his wife, who can't even admit. He broke off, running a hand through his hair in frustration. Admit what? Jessica moved closer. Tell me, Michael, for once in your life, just tell me the truth. That I'm terrified. His voice cracked. That every time you smile at me, or laugh at my attempts to cook, or look at me like I'm worth something more than my bank account, I fall a little deeper. That I watch you with Annie and see the family I never thought I wanted. That I can't sleep unless I know you're safe. Can't focus unless I know you're happy. Can't breathe when I think about you leaving. Then don't let me leave. Jessica reached for him, her hands framing his face. Fight for me. Fight for us. I don't know how. His eyes were tortured. Jessica, I don't know how to be what you need. You already are. She stroked his cheek, feeling him tremble. The man who checks on my sister every hour, who protects me without smothering me, who looks at me like I'm precious but never tries to own me. That's exactly what I need. Michael's hands came up to cover hers. I'm not good at this, at feeling things, at letting people in. I know. She smiled through her tears. But you're learning, we both are. The contract was never just business. She pressed closer. Not for me, and not for you either. Admit it. He closed his eyes, pressing his forehead to hers. No, he whispered. It wasn't just business. It was never just business. Then kiss me, Jessica breathed. Not because you have to, not because we're married on paper. Kiss me because you want to, because you feel something real, because... His mouth captured hers, stealing the words and her breath along with them. This kiss was different from their others, desperate yet tender, passionate yet sweet. Michael kissed her like a man coming home, like he was finally letting himself have something he'd denied for too long. When they broke apart, he didn't let her go. Stay, he whispered against her lips. Not because of a contract or Annie's treatment or any other reason except that I think I'm falling in love with you. Jessica's heart soared. You think? I know. He kissed her again softly. God help me. I know. Outside the window, unseen by either of them, Henry Callahan smiled as his driver pulled away from the estate. Sometimes, he reflected, the best business decisions really did come from the heart. That you're staring again, Jessica murmured, not looking up from her book. She sat curled in what had become her favorite spot in Michael's home office, a plush armchair by the window, bathed in afternoon sunlight. I'm allowed to stare at my wife. The warmth in Michael's voice still surprised her, even 2 weeks after their confrontation in the living room. He'd been different since then, softer around the edges, more willing to show what he felt. Oh, you'll miss your conference call? They can wait. He rose from his desk and crossed to her chair, dropping a kiss on the top of her head. I'm still not convinced you won't disappear if I look away too long. Jessica marked her place and looked up at him. I'm not going anywhere. No. His smile held a hint of old insecurity. Even though Annie's latest scans are clear, even though you don't need the contract anymore. Michael! She caught his hand, lacing their fingers together. I'm not here because of a contract. I haven't been for a long time. He pulled her to her feet and into his arms, burying his face in her hair. These moments of vulnerability were still rare, still precious. I keep waiting to wake up. Mr. Callahan, Rebecca's voice came through the intercom. The board is waiting. Michael sighed against Jessica's neck. Duty call, go. She straightened his tie. I'm having lunch with Annie anyway. His eyes lit up. She's feeling well enough to go out. Thanks to you and Dr. Walsh. Jessica kissed him softly. I'll see you tonight. Dinner at 7. He caught her hand as she turned to leave. Jessica, I love you. He said it casually now, naturally, like breathing. Each time still made her heart skip. Undine, I love you too. At Les Bernardins, the same restaurant where they'd first discussed their arrangement, Annie practically vibrated with excitement. You're glowing, she declared. Both of you are. It's actually kind of disgusting how in love you are. Jessica laughed. Says the woman who just got engaged to her doctor. Annie's hand flew to the diamond ring on her finger. During her treatment, she'd grown close to one of Dr. Walsh's residents, a brilliant young oncologist named David Chen. Their engagement last week had been a celebration of both love and life. Annie's cancer was officially in remission. Speaking of disgustingly in love, Annie's eyes focused on something over Jessica's shoulder. Look who just walked in. Jessica turned to see Charlotte Pierce and her mother entering the restaurant. Charlotte spotted them immediately, her perfect features twisting with barely concealed disdain. Jessica, darling. Victoria Pierce's voice dripped honey-coated venom as she approached their table. How lovely to see you. We've heard such interesting rumors about your marriage. Have you? Jessica's voice was calm. Funny. I heard some interesting things about your involvement with Noah Pierce's attempted blackmail. Victoria's smile faltered. I'm sure I don't know what you mean. No. Jessica took a sip of water. You might want to ask Noah about that. Oh, wait, you can't. He's taken a sudden job opportunity in Alaska. Very sudden, very far away. The older woman's face went pale. Charlotte, we're leaving. As they rushed away, Annie burst out laughing. God, that was beautiful. Michael's ruthlessness is rubbing off on you. Michael's not ruthless. Jessica defended automatically. He's protective of you. Annie's expression softened. Because he loves you. For real this time. It was real before, Jessica admitted. We just couldn't admit it. And now? Now, Jessica smiled, remembering Michael's morning kisses, his gentle touches, the way he looked at her like she was everything. Now we're building something true, something that's ours, not just on paper. Her phone buzzed with a text from Michael. Missing you. Board meeting hell. Save me. Annie read the message over her shoulder and grinned. Go! Save your husband from death by PowerPoint. Just remember, rehearsal dinner on Friday. David's parents are flying in. We'll be there. Jessica hugged her sister tight. I love you, Annie. Love you too, Jessie. Annie squeezed her hand. I'm so happy you found your fairy tale, even if it started with a contract. At Callahan Technologies, Jessica slipped into the boardroom just as Michael was wrapping up his presentation. His entire face lit up when he saw her, making several board members exchange knowing looks. Mrs. Callahan, Henry winked at her. Come to rescue my grandson. Just supporting my husband. She took the empty seat beside Michael, feeling him relax as soon as she was near. The meeting ended quickly after that. As the board members filed out, Henry paused by their chairs. You know, he said thoughtfully, when I gave you that ultimatum, Michael, I hoped you'd find someone who could thaw that frozen heart of yours. I never dreamed you'd find someone who could make it sing. Michael's hand found Jessica's under the table. Neither did I, grandfather. Neither did I. Later that night, they lay tangled together in what was now their bedroom. No more separate suites, no more careful distance. I have something for you. Michael reached into his nightstand and pulled out an envelope. Jessica opened it to find their original contract, torn in half. We don't need this anymore, he said softly. I don't want anything between us except what's real. She traced the torn edges of the paper. It was always real, even when we were pretending it wasn't. I know. He pulled her closer. I was so afraid of loving you that I almost lost you. Never again. Never again, she agreed, curling into his arms. They fell asleep like that, the torn contract forgotten on the floor, replaced by something far more binding than paper and ink, two hearts that had found their way home through all the pretense to something true. In the garden below their window, the first roses of summer began to bloom, their sweet scent carrying on the warm breeze. Like love itself, they had grown from careful cultivation into something wild and beautiful, and completely their own. 1 year to the day after their own wedding, Michael and Jessica Callahan stood in the garden of the Greenwich estate, watching final preparations for Annie's wedding reception. White roses and twinkling lights transformed the space into something magical, but Michael couldn't take his eyes off his wife. "You're doing it again," Jessica said, smoothing her bridesmaid's dress. "Doing what? Looking at me like you're still surprised I'm here." Michael pulled her close, not caring that they were surrounded by wedding planners and caterers. "Every day with you is a surprise. The good kind, charmer." But she melted into him, fitting perfectly against his chest like she'd been made to be there. "Hey, lovebirds!" Annie's voice rang out across the garden. She practically floated toward them in her wedding dress, radiant with health and happiness. "Save it for after the ceremony. Right now, I need to steal my sister for final touches." Michael kissed Jessica's temple before releasing her. "Don't be long. You know how I get when you're too far away. Restless, brooding, generally impossible." Jessica teased, all of the above. His smile was soft, intimate. "I love you. I love you too." She squeezed his hand before following Annie inside. In the bridal suite, Rebecca was already waiting with champagne. "The photographer's ready, whenever you are." "In a minute." Annie sat carefully, mindful of her dress. "First, I need to thank you both." "For what?" Jessica asked, accepting a glass. "For everything." Annie's eyes grew misty. "Jessie, you sacrificed so much for me, were willing to marry a stranger just to save my life. And Rebecca—" "I just made a suggestion," Rebecca demurred. "You made magic." Annie raised her glass. "You saw what they couldn't see, that they were perfect for each other. That a business arrangement could become a love story." Jessica thought of that first meeting at Le Bernardin, how terrified and desperate she'd been. "I never expected—" She paused, emotion catching in her throat. "I never expected him." "None of us did," Rebecca said softly. "Donna, I knew he needed someone like you, but I never dreamed you'd actually break through those walls." "Speaking of walls," Annie grinned, "remember last month when Henry showed us the security footage of Michael practicing his proposal in his office?" Jessica touched the new diamond ring on her finger, not the one from their arranged marriage, but the one Michael had given her 2 weeks ago, dropping to one knee in their kitchen and asking her to marry him for real this time. "Well, he was so nervous," she remembered fondly, "as if I might say no." "Well, you did make him work for it," Rebecca teased. "All those months of breaking down his defenses. Worth it," Jessica said simply. "He was worth everything." A knock at the door interrupted them. Henry Callahan poked his head in, eyes twinkling. "Ladies, they're ready for you. And Jessica, you might want to check on my grandson. He's wearing a hole in the garden path." Jessica found Michael exactly where Henry had said, pacing beneath the rose arbor. He stopped at the sight of her, eyes drinking her in like a man dying of thirst. "Better?" she asked, sliding into his arms. "Much?" He pressed his face to her hair. "I was thinking about our wedding day. How sure I was that love was a fantasy, that I could keep my heart safe behind contracts and conditions. And now I know that real love isn't safe at all." His voice roughened. "It's terrifying and wonderful, and the best risk I've ever taken." Michael Callahan, admitting something's better than a careful business plan. Jessica pretended to be shocked. "Who are you and what have you done with my husband?" "Your husband learned that some things can't be controlled or quantified." He traced her cheek with gentle fingers. Some things just have to be felt. The wedding march began to play, calling them to their places. As they watched Annie walk down the aisle toward David, Jessica felt Michael's arms tighten around her waist. "Happy," she whispered. "Complete," he corrected. "You, more than I ever dreamed possible." After the ceremony, as sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and pink, Michael led Jessica onto the dance floor for Annie and David's first dance. Other couples joined them, but they remained lost in their own world. "Do you remember our first dance?" Michael asked. "When I was trying so hard not to feel anything for you. You failed spectacularly at that." "Thank God." He pressed his forehead to hers. "You know, the contract would have ended today. Good thing we tore it up. Good thing we wrote our own story instead." As if on cue, Henry clinked his glass for the toast. The old man's eyes were suspiciously bright as he looked at the two couples, Annie and David, Michael and Jessica. "To love," he said simply, "in all its unexpected forms, to contracts that become commitments, arrangements that become attachments, and business deals that become the best kind of merger, the merger of two hearts." "To love," everyone echoed. Later that night, after the last guest had gone, and Annie and David had left for their honeymoon, Michael and Jessica walked hand in hand through their moonlit garden. "I have something for you," Michael said, pulling an envelope from his pocket. Jessica opened it to find a new contract, but not the kind she expected. At the top, in Michael's precise handwriting, was written, "I, Michael Callahan, hereby promise to love you more each day than the day before. Never take for granted the miracle of finding you. Always remember that real love is better than any business deal. Cherish every moment of our unexpected fairy tale. Thank whatever fate, circumstance, or meddling grandfather brought you into my life." Below, there was a space for signatures, but instead of signing it, Michael took the paper and tore it in half. "We don't need contracts anymore," he said softly. "Just promises, just love, just us." Jessica kissed him under the stars, surrounded by roses and memories and the sweet certainty of belonging. They'd started with a business arrangement, moved through careful attraction to undeniable love, and ended up exactly where they were meant to be, in each other's arms, their hearts beating the same rhythm, their love story written not in ink, but in every shared breath, every tender touch, every moment of choosing each other. Some might call it a modern fairy tale, the billionaire and the girl who married him for money only to win his frozen heart. But Michael and Jessica knew it was something better than a fairy tale. It was real, and that made it perfect. The end. That was a beautiful story, wasn't it? I hope you enjoyed it. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your collaboration is very important to me.